The joint hearings of the House and Senate Select Committees will come to order. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois for a unanimous consent request.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record, following an insertion made yesterday at the behest of Senator Inouye, a Washington Post editorial Tuesday, April 17, 1984, a Washington Post article April 16, 1984 by Joanne Omeng and Charles Babcock, and a New York Times article of April 16, 1984 by Bernard Gortzman.
Without objection, they will be entered into the record. The Chair is advised that the Senate is voting. We'll go ahead anyway, and because we want to try to complete this morning our sessions with Mr. McFarlane. This afternoon we will turn to Mr. Gaston Segur and Mr. Robert Owen as the two witnesses. Mr. McFarlane, I remind you once again that you continue under oath, as I know you understand, and we will begin the questioning with Congressman Brooks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning again, Mr. McFarlane. You can be happy today. This is the last day you're going to be here.
Good morning, sir.
I wanted to remove a few doubts in my mind, which I think you could, a few little nagging things. But I wondered, did you have any other meetings with the Iranians after you left the meeting in Tehran, when you abruptly left after learning that all the hostages would not be released in exchange for weapons?
No, sir, I have not.
You had no other meetings?
No, sir, I did not.
During any of your meetings while in Iran, was there any discussion of the $454 million frozen funds, which the State Department just the other day, within the last couple of days, has announced they're going to release to Iran?
There was a mention of it by the most senior person that I met with from the government. His point was to insist that this money had been held wrongfully by us and ought to be released.
Did you mention that they were holding wrongfully hostages that belonged to us?
At some length, yes, sir.
Was there any discussion about supplying Iran with top-secret military intelligence in exchange for keeping the secret information about CIA's intelligence network that they had secured by torturing Buckley before he died? They had threatened to give it to the Russians, I understand, and was there any discussion of their keeping it in exchange for weapons or whatever?
Mr. Chairman, I've seen those reports, and they are utterly false. In no sense ever in my hearing was any such so-called deal ever proposed or even considered, discussed, or otherwise mentioned.
Now, Mr. McFarlane, you've testified on 2 occasions that you asked Colonel North if he had approval for diverting funds from the Iranian arms sales to the Contras. And he said yes, that he would never do anything without approval. What do you think he meant by approval? By whom?
I had the impression that that had to mean, at least by Admiral Poindexter, and that I have no basis for judging beyond that. He made no other comment on it.
Well, based on your knowledge of structure in the White House and the National Security Council, do you believe that only Poindexter would have made a major decision like that to divert funds to the Contras, or would that decision have necessitated the approval of the chief executive of the country?
Mr. Chairman, I think my own knowledge on it extends only to what I have said. Something of that magnitude, assuming it were brought to the Admiral's attention, I'm sure he would not undertake on his own authority. But because I cannot say conclusively that it was indeed brought to his attention and on to anybody else's, I'm speculating here.
When you were head of the National Security Council and a decision like that would have been made, would you have made a unilateral decision to extend money to the Contras in violation of the congressional law?
No, sir.
Not without checking with the President, is that right?
That's right, sir.
Now, Mr. McFarlane, I note in the paper this morning that it is said that you helped twice with the Saudis to get funds for the Contras. Once before the Bowling Amendment, and then once there's an allegation that when the king came over in '85 and visited with the President, that you went out there to McLean in that low-rent area, and you have to pay for your own garbage out there, I'll tell you that. You went out and visited at the ambassador's residence and talked with the king and asked for $15 million to help the Contras. Did you have that meeting?
Mr. Chairman, I've testified fully and truthfully as to my involvement in the provision of funds by that country. I have seen the reports of this morning's newspaper. It seems to me, more than anything else, sad that this government is put in that position, and I think it ought not be in that position. I stand by everything I have testified to. It is perhaps worthwhile to also note that the committee has had available to it the record that is kept of my schedule, of everywhere that I come and go and when and how long it lasts, and I urge that it be examined to see whether there is any apparent discrepancy.
I don't
believe
mean
there
to
is.
trouble you, but did you have that meeting with the king out at there or not?
I remember no such meeting,
You
sir.
remember no such meeting. You don't say there was none.
Well, I have met with His Highness in Saudi Arabia. I don't believe that we had any meeting here. I was present at his meeting with President Reagan, except for the last 10-minute one-on-one. I don't believe there was any meeting at the residence.
Now, Mr. McFarlane, are you aware of any U.S. funds other than those from the Iranian arms sales that found their way into the Contra effort or were intended to go to the Contras directly or indirectly, such as AID funds, State Department funds, currency exchange activities, or any other device for transferring money?
No, sir.
Now, yesterday you testified that you had discussed activities of Colonel North and the Boland Amendment with President Reagan, and you indicated that you were concerned that Colonel North might try to raise money during his speaking engagements on behalf of the Contras, but that the President had a far more liberal interpretation of the Boland Amendment than you did. And what did you mean by a more liberal interpretation? Could you describe the conversations that led to that conclusion, your conclusion?
Yes, sir. I think it's probably a poor choice of words on my part. What I intended was to reflect that in our conversations, the President often noted his belief that the tradition in the United States of helping freedom fighters, as he referred to them, was very clear and he thought entirely legal. He would refer occasionally to the volunteers that fought in the Spanish Civil War in the 30s, referred to others that have gone overseas to fight before we were formally at war, joined other countries' armed forces, and said that he believed that this tradition that goes all the way back to our own revolution and the assistance we got from the French is one that we should identify with and support. But that is not to say that he urged or in any way authorized me or anyone else to take any illegal activity. And on your first point, sir, if I implied that I was telling him about possible violations of law by Colonel North, I didn't intend that. When I would say that Colonel North is out speaking, I said it just like that, reported that it was to groups that in many cases were supportive, other times not.
Mr. McFarlane, just a few more questions. On your trip to Tehran in '86, by whom were you employed?
I was self-employed at the time, sir.
And from whom did you get your instructions?
I received from Admiral Poindexter, I believe, 4 pages of typed instructions called terms of reference. I asked whether the cabinet had been involved, or Secretary Schultz in particular, and he said that he had, and that these instructions were approved by the President.
And did you consider yourself to be in charge while that trip was underway of that activity?
Yes, sir, I did.
What led you to that conclusion?
Well, I was the senior person on the trip. I wouldn't have gone if I hadn't been in charge.
What authority did Colonel North have to order the second plane load of weapons dispatched?
Well, I think it was the kind of anticipatory initiative that an aggressive young officer might take, but he didn't do anything that would have been prejudicial, that I could not stop and turn around. His motive was no doubt to assure readiness for a contingent possibility that just never matured, and I turned it off. Could have been that way.
It could have been. Who received the order from Colonel North, and why would they carry it out if you were in charge for a major aspect of that, which is the second plane load of parts?
Well, I expect that he communicated back to the command post in Tel Aviv and passed the word there. But it was a little over-exuberant, yes, sir.
To whom did you give the order to turn that plane around?
Colonel North, sir. To Colonel North.
And he then executed it.
Yes, sir.
What was your reaction to Colonel North when you learned that he had ordered that second plane to take off without any instruction from you?
Well, I was upset and very abrupt with him and short. He explained what contingent possibility of release of 2 people that morning had led him to do that, and the commitment firmly that the Iranians had made that that would occur, and to avoid waking me and to be ready for it if it did. He took that action, but he also didn't take it before such time as it would have been impossible for me to turn around. That is, he did it late enough to where he knew that the plane would not have reached the point of no return on its fuel and so forth.
Did you report this act of insubordination to Admiral Poindexter or anyone else on your return?
I didn't, but throughout the trip we had comms between the rear station in Washington and the Situation Room as well as Tel Aviv there, so I assumed that all of this history was being put down in logs at each of those locations.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my time has expired.
The chair recognizes the Majority Leader, Mr. Foley.
Chairman, I have no questions. Thank you.
The chair recognizes Mr. McCullough.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McFarlane, in following up on the Tehran questions that Mr. Brooks was just asking you, some things occur to me. In anticipation of this trip to Tehran, was there any advance trip that went over there, any advance group that went to Tehran to prepare the way, or was the meeting that you had earlier the only one there was to prepare for this?
It was the only one.
General Secord in his testimony last week was very critical of the fact there was no advance trip, and I'll quote from what he said in response to questions on that area. He said, "It was strongly recommended by 3 of us, Near, myself, and North. We're all recommending that a prefatory meeting take place. There was, after all, as far as I knew, no agenda even agreed to for this meeting. And so it seemed to me, at least, and I think to the others, to be not well organized. In fact, I have been to many, many international meetings, and I don't think I've ever been to one where there wasn't some prefatory work done in advance. However, the position was taken that there would be no advance prefatory meeting, and the terms and conditions that had been agreed to in Frankfurt were sufficient, and that they would, and that the Iranian side would simply have to deal with that. And so there was no advance meeting, and that was a big mistake. Do you have any response to that comment by General Secor? Do you think he was accurate, that it was a big mistake not to have an advance meeting, or could you tell us why there was none?
I think it's a very valid comment, and had I known that the preparations, such as you mentioned, the agreement on agenda, clear agreement to the terms for the release of the hostages, commitments that were credible on the counterpart who would meet with me in those sessions, all of those, I was assured, were resolved. Obviously, they were not, and it is, in part, a consequence that there wasn't enough preparation. I was told that at the Frankfurt meeting, the agenda was agreed and so forth, and all of these other things were in place.
Who assured you these things were resolved? Admiral Poindexter, Gabanifar, who?
Admiral Poindexter and Colonel North.
General Secord also was asked some questions relative to the discussions that took place regarding the hostages. He said prior to the question was, prior to McFarlane's trip, had there been, prior to this time, his plane actually took off, had there been discussions on the subject of hostages? And General Secord said in response to that, well, there was a lot of discussions. I told you that the hostages were discussed at the Frankfurt meeting. Hostages were discussed with Near and with Gabanifar frequently, by North and by me. But as far as I know, and this will surprise some people, I guess, but as far as I know, there was no Iranian agreement to produce all the hostages at the time of the meeting in Tehran. I know that expectation arose somehow. I don't know how exactly that expectation got into McFarlane's head. You'll have to ask him. I don't know. So I'm asking you.
That's what I was told.
By Admiral Poindexter?
That's right.
And that was not indeed the case when you got there. At least that's not the response that was there in Tehran from those with whom you were dealing. Is that correct?
That is correct. It seemed to me then the way in which the Iranians with whom I met, and the most senior one was, you might say, in the outer office of the speaker there, gave me the impression that while he was surprised at my expectation of the release of the hostages, that after a recess in which he apparently closeted with Gabanifar and one or two of the other subordinates, that he was also conscious that his own people had not filled him in completely on what they had committed to. Now, whether he believed that they had welched or not is, I don't think I would go that far, but the fact is that that is the kind of thing that you should never go unless that is nailed down. And it wasn't.
The fact is that there wasn't that advance trip, and the fact is that there was a screw-up in that sense of communication, and General Secord at least was of the impression, as one of the parties sitting in on some of the Frankfurt meetings, that there was no understanding, at least at that meeting, reached for the exchange of the hostages. So can you agree that this sounds to us and perhaps to the public reasonably that the whole thing was just basically screwed up from a planning standpoint before you ever went?
Well, I think that is fair, and it is frankly astonishing to me because I didn't view this as a lark by any means, and I spent quite a long time going over the minimum conditions that would warrant sending a personal representative of the president to Iran, and they included firm, credible guarantees on the preconditions, that is, setting behind us all of the arms trafficking and prisoner release, and then agreement on the agenda, the 4 points that were acceptable to both sides, that the meetings would be with the Speaker, the Prime Minister, and the President, and so forth, And on each of these points was said, yes, you are right, that's in place, finally. Now, I would have to say that I was told that inasmuch as we believed these things, the Iranians have welched before. Well, I pondered that, drew them out, Admiral Poindexter and Colonel North, about what makes you sure this time that it's going to work. But I think your point is quite right. Clearly, those commitments were not.
Well, General Secord even told us he was under the impression that once you got there, it turns out that they weren't really even expecting you, that was a surprise to some extent. There was a lot of scurrying around that went on over there. It's the reason, in his conclusion at least, in talking to us, at least his opinion, that you had such an awkward situation there for so many hours, and that there was a lack of communication right up front about your even coming in when you did. Is that your impression?
Well, I think they weren't expecting us at the hour, or for some reason they hadn't gotten the motorcade and so forth formed up, as you would kind of expect. But they clearly did expect us. They just weren't there on time, and that is not uncommon for them.
Let me ask you something else relative to
You know,
this. 'Cause
Mr. McCollum, I'm sorry, I meant to say earlier that I think the general is absolutely right. But it doesn't seem to me to be beyond the wit of man to expect that he might have said so. I mean, as I went on the trip with the opportunity to talk to Colonel North and reconfirm these matters, and to talk to Mr. Teicher, his understanding of events, and had reconfirmed for me, yes, it's going to go that way. Well, General Secord was there. And while I associated with him at the time with the transport and kind of the cargo arrangements, if he knew these things, it might have been nice to know of it.
But he didn't tell you.
No, sir.
Well, that brings me even more to the point of this question. I asked him another question. I didn't ask those others of him, but I asked this one of him, and I'd like to ask you, with all the resources, to me, because this is fundamental about the policy and why we're where we are today and all this, with all of the resources of the CIA and the DIA and the State Department and the Special Operations Forces of the military that we have in this country, why did you and Admiral Poindexter and Director Casey and Colonel North and whoever else was making these decisions, why did you choose to go outside these regular operational resources and try to handle the Iran dealings and the hostage rescue and release efforts with nearly no use of the resources at all? And that's the way it appears to me.
Well, Mr. McCollum, I do wish that we had some resources, but I think if you go today and every office, bureau, and division in the CIA and the DIA and round up all of the assets we have to learn of or do business in Iran, you could fit them in this room with a lot of space left over.
I think that that's really the point I wanted to make, and I'd like to emphasize that, if I could, with you by asking a very specific question on that. Looking back at the Iran initiative, how did the quality of our human intelligence and the specific lack of that intelligence affect the initiative, Mr. McFarlane?
Well, I think it was very, very harmful in removing from us the ability to validate what intelligence we were being given and to be confident of its accuracy. At the same time, the implication of that is, until you can get it, you should do nothing. Well, I don't think that's a responsible course either. You do extend your risk very substantially, however, if you proceed without certain confidence that what you are told is accurate.
Was it because of this lack of the human intelligence? Was that a major factor in why you used the Gavanafar
Yes,
channel
it
and did
was.
this extraordinary thing that you did?
Yes, it was.
And, you know, the American people have asked many times, and they've asked me back home, I'm sure they've asked the colleagues whether they're on this committee or not, you know, why did the president deal with these Iranians like this? And, of course, part of the answer is you did want to open the channel. I understand. You wanted to make the contact. But they also asked, why didn't we just go in and rescue these hostages out of Lebanon? And it seems to me you've answered that, too. We didn't have, apparently, the ability to do that. But I don't know. Is that the problem? Was this same situation, this lack of confidence in our resources and our intelligence and so on, the reason we didn't go in and actually do that job?
I think that is 90% of the reason. On the other side of things, the forces trained for that kind of operation are at hand, and I think Secretary Weinberger and the chairman, Joint Chiefs, can take a lot of credit for the preparation of appropriate forces, but it is more than that. It is having people on the ground in advance who are collectors of intelligence that report back to you and can serve as the lead point on the ground, advance for whatever raid you might care to run. But the fact is, today, you've got to have intelligence first, and we don't have it.
Well, you know, speaking of the Secretary Weinberg and Secretary Schultz, many times has been reiterated in these hearings that they disagreed with the Iranian initiative. Did they offer any alternatives for reopening contact with the Iranians or for rescuing or winning the release of the hostages?
No, sir.
General Secord testified that, in his opinion, Director Casey was very frustrated with the system of the CIA itself and in many other ways with the system. Do you share that opinion?
I don't think I'm qualified to answer, Mr. McCollum. I respected and do respect Bill Casey as a man who was devoted to promoting our national interest and more loyal to his president than anyone I've ever seen. A man of considerable intellect as well and canniness as it relates to intelligence operations. I think he was conscious, though, that it wasn't entirely the agency's fault, that it was completely lacking in the resources to fulfill this mission. He's very conscious of what happened 10 years ago and abuses within the CIA and excesses by the Congress, which led to this depletion of our intelligence capability. But it was real.
What happened 10 years ago?
Well, I think when the abuses that had occurred in the CIA were identified and exposed, that the Congress and the Church and Pike committees and the Rockefeller Commission combined to make the point that covert operations, human intelligence were risky, that you could end up before the Congress being interrogated for what you have done, and for career people in intelligence who must always be suspicious of political figures who come in and out of administrations, people who by and large they assert don't have the career bureaucracy's interests at heart, that the safest course is to do nothing. Now that doesn't apply to everyone. There are clearly very, very talented and operationally oriented people, but they're a small group.
Well, you were frustrated yourself, were you not, by a lot of this?
Yes, sir.
And would you not say that Colonel North was frustrated?
Yes, sir.
And would you not say Admiral Poindexter also was frustrated?
Yes, sir. Outstanding men, both of them.
I have one last comment, and it's just a comment I'd like to make. I have respected the responses you've given and your analysis of the situation. I think you have a deep understanding of history and of the problems that we face in the broader perspective, and that's what this committee is really all about in the long run, not just to look at facts. But you used a term yesterday that bothers me. You said that in answer to some questions that you were intending to be supplicant, and I respect that to an extent, and I understand why you might have used that term here based on all that's happened. But looking back on the last 2 or 3 days' worth of testimony, I am disturbed by the fact that, at least in terms of giving some advice perhaps to the President and in viewing some of the matters that you were indeed allowing the President and the administration to be too supplicant to Congress. It seems to me that this whole question of fundraising, that it's been pointed out in the last 2 or 3 days, at least for the President, maybe the NSC is questionable as to whether you're covered by the Boland Amendment. With regard to the President and other agencies of government, technically, legally, there was nothing wrong with their fundraising. Going out, if the President had wanted to go out and make an appeal to the American public, give money to the Contras. I suppose there were political considerations that were weighed as to why that was chosen not to be done. But legal advice was apparently not sought. And in the last analysis, what we failed to have was some confrontation with Congress over this whole issue. And it seems to me, with all due respect, it's that lack of confrontation, that lack of bringing this issue to a head in the public forum that may have led in the long run to a lot of the problems we've got today with a president who's looked upon as having to check his diary to see what he said about something because perhaps he was worried and is still worried, and they are down there about, every step we take, we have to look over our shoulder like you're talking about those CIA folks. Everybody's looking over their shoulder. And in fact, he didn't need to look over his shoulder about all these things. He still doesn't need to look over his shoulder about all of them. And that bothers me, and I think your use of the word supplicant somewhat applies to that. But I appreciate very much your testimony, and I thank you for your time with us. You've certainly put in a great service and longevity to our country, and you're continuing to do so today. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Heflin.
Colonel McFarlane, let me ask you about some things that you have mentioned, but perhaps maybe necessary to go into a little more detail. You testified about the shipment of arms to the Contras that was seized by a military official in a Central American country, and then indicated that a number of government officials were involved and that there was a contact made by the president to the head of state of that Central American country to get that shipment of arms released. Do you know what the shipment of arms contained?
No, sir.
Do the timing relative to this, as I understand it, is probably around March or February of 1985. Is that approximately right, or in that period that you think that this occurred?
Senator Heflin, I may have confused in my mind that event with, I think, a separate event wherein a Central American country had become very, very unwilling to serve as a transit point for weapons going to the Contras because they thought it might engender a Nicaraguan attack of them, and they wouldn't have any reaction from the United States, and therefore, until they could get some kind of high-level assurance that the United States was going to stand by its obligations to them, they weren't going to let it happen. And I do remember that after soliciting the advice and concurrence of the Secretary of State, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Secretary of Defense, and the DCI, the President did, I thought, send a message, but it may have been a phone call. The staff can confirm or deny.
Well, as you understand it, there was some action by the President with the head of that country
Yes,
to
sir.
obtain the release of that seized shipment of arms.
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, let me ask you a little bit about this matter pertaining to Country 2. There have been some news reports today about unnamed Saudi sources that have indicated that you did some solicitation of the contributions that were made by Country 2, some in 1984 and some then in 1985, as I recall the newspaper account that I have seen today. Now, if it was before the Boland Amendment, which was adopted on October the 12th, 1984, I believe, 84 is when the Boland, which is the one in the center there, if that may be prior to that time, was there any prohibition relative to any language it could be construed that would prohibit any seeking of private sources, including foreign countries, at that time?
No, sir, there was no prohibition on it.
Now, after the Boland 2, which is the one in green up above, was adopted, then it comes up a question as to how do you interpret that relative to it. Do you want to make any statement pertaining to this press report, to give an answer on that? I think in fairness, you ought to be allowed to be asked about that.
Well, Senator Heflin, I said earlier, I think sad that this government is in the position that it has to change publicly its earlier position. It shouldn't be exposed to this kind of public exposure to criticism and comment. And I think our government, I bear responsibility for it. The fact is that the way I've testified here, and every word I stand by, as you say, had I done it, had I solicited before October of 1984, it wouldn't have been against the law. I also pointed out that if staff cares to examine the newspaper account and match it against my own record of schedule, which is pretty thorough, as to where I was every moment of the day, it's difficult to square that with the account that is the new position taken by that government. But I frankly identify and sympathize with them because they are now embarrassed, and it's our fault, my fault.
Let me look at the Boylan Amendment, which is in the center in green there. And really, I think the applicable part is the first paragraph. The rest of it below there refers to the fact that if a president submits to Congress a report and then that a joint resolution is adopted. So really the part that is in point here is the first paragraph. And you have testified about the National Security Council, but I want to look at it and try to put in perspective how the Boylan Amendment affects the activities of the president, vice president. Now, I think that before the president can be accused of any illegal act in these two instances that I've mentioned, one the country to, and the other relative to the Central American Company and the shipment of and the seizure of arms and the release of those arms, that there are a number of questions that must be addressed besides constitutional issues. Among these, of course, number one, did his acts constitute illegal acts under the Boylan Amendment? And second, did the Boylan Amendment prohibit his acts? And I think maybe it's wise to pursue the second question first and assume, for the sake of argument, that the president did solicit Country 2's leader and did contact the president about releasing the shipment of arms. Now, the Boylan Amendment is contained primarily in the Defense Authorization Act, which appears there, adopted October the 12th, 1984, and was really applicable for a period of time, at least a year or close to a year following that. Now, but it also at the same time, there are two other acts that were passed at about the same time, a Supplemental Appropriations Act, and then about a month later, an Intelligence Authorization Act. Now, those acts contain some different language, and they're not exactly the same, and I think proper interpretations will have to be determined. But assuming for the sake of argument that there are no real conflicts between these various enactments and the intent of Congress is unambiguous, and we look at the Boylan Amendment, and in looking at the Boylan Amendment, we see, of course, the prohibition that is there, and it says no funds available. I think you have to look and see whether or not that's a comprehensive prohibition or is it a limited prohibition. And I think the answer, of course, is that you have to say that it is a limited prohibition because it names the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, and any other agency or entity of the United States involved in intelligence activities. If, for example, AID, the Agency for in the national development or the Drug Enforcement Agency, if they were not involved in intelligence activities, that would not be a prohibition against their expenditure of funds. Now, the language of this is very broad. It, in my judgment, includes, by the word indirect there, it includes humanitarian aid that might be given. So we then come down to the question, does it control the activity of the President and the Vice President? Now, you look at that language, and it does not contain any specific prohibition against the President or the Vice President by name. Now, I think before the action of the President can be viewed as illegal, we have to answer the following question, among others. Did the President obligate or expend funds available to an agency or entity involved in intelligence activities in getting the head of state of country 2 to contribute funds for the purpose of supporting military operations in Nicaragua? Now, as to the action of the President in releasing the seized shipment of arms, a similar question I think has to be addressed. Did the President obligate or expend funds available to an agency or entity involved in intelligence activities in getting the President of a Central American country to release a shipment of seized arms in that country that were used for the purpose of supporting military or paramilitary operations in Nicaragua? Now, I think that this is going to call for a very careful research into these matters and to see whether or not that language does prohibit the President or not. It also involves the question of facts, and the facts, as we have heard, and perhaps other facts relative to these matters. So I think in proper perspective that it's wise not to jump to conclusions, but to review all of the facts and review the language and review the law pertaining to statutory construction before we come to any such conclusion. Now, let me ask you one other question. In your conversations with General Secord, did he ever indicate to you whether or not he was an agent of CIA or whether he was, in effect, an independent contractor?
He did not describe the relationship, sir.
That's all.
The chair recognizes Mr. Stokes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McFarlane, one of the most troublesome aspects of this whole tragedy to me is the Drug Enforcement Agency ransom operation. As you and I both know, the United States has not paid ransom for captured American citizens since the day of the Barbary pirates. So it seemed to me that this was a momentous decision. It was one where the President of the United States was entitled to the best advice possible, including opposing views. And the NSC was there for that purpose. Can you tell us why the NSC was not used for that purpose, considering the momentous decision the President had to make?
Well, I think you make a very good point, Mr. Stokes. In trying to recall myself how the decision was taken, it was a matter that I discussed with the President, presence of the Vice President, and probably Mr. Reagan, and I provided to them the fact that the Attorney General was supportive of it and had taken the steps to to make the liaison between the DEA people and the people in the field. And I'm trying to think the extent of knowledge of the Secretary of State, and I will just have to think about it. I believe you're right, however, that a fuller discussion of it would have been in order. It is lamentable to say, and this is not to defend it, but that virtually every single decision that I think we've taken, at least when I served in government, was in the public domain within 24 hours. And that cannot lead us into becoming just isolated, independent actors.
Earlier on in your testimony, you told us that you were aware of only one finding with language similar to the January 17, 1986 Iran finding. That is, of language directing that Congress not be told until the President so directed. To your knowledge, has Congress now been told about that particular matter?
I don't know, sir.
Your answer is that you do not know?
No, sir. I'm trying to remember whether before I left the government it was, but I might not have been aware that it was, and I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay. Let me move to, to another point with you. There was a great deal of discussion yesterday about Congress having changed his mind several times, having been sending one message at one time, a different message at another time. And there was considerable discussion around the fact that a commitment had been made by the United States to the Contras, and that Congress had gone back on that commitment. I just want to go over the record with you for just a moment as to what the real facts are. And I'm really going over the records of the Intelligence Committee of the House when I make reference to the things I want to talk to you about. We have exhaustive detail regarding the matters that I want to talk to you about. And I think they reflect that the commitment that the United States made to the Contras was not the same one that was described to the Congress. For instance, would you agree with me that the Contras were told by the United States that they would help them march to Managua? And yet the Congress was told that the Contras were to interdict arms from Nicaragua to El Salvador. Would you agree to that?
Yes, sir.
Also, the United States was encouraging the Contras to swell their numbers, while the Congress was being told that 5 to 10-man teams would conduct interdiction raids on the arms infiltration infrastructure. Is that correct?
I don't know. I've never heard that, but I can imagine it.
Okay. I think it also would be accurate for me to say, as you did the other day, that Bolin 1 did rescue the Contra program for a time, but only because Congress was proceeding on an entirely misleading justification from the administration. You have said also that the mining of Nicaraguan harbors was another example of misleading Congress. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir.
In fact, the House Intelligence Committee learned of the mining 3 weeks after it had been done. But it only knew because it asked the right questions, and only after 7 months of asking the same questions and getting no for an answer. And as you and I both know, those mines weren't procured and tested and put in operation overnight. And so Congress was deliberately misled in certain aspects of this whole Nicaraguan program. So I would just have to say, Mr. McFarlane, that the distrust that marked executive congressional relations on Nicaragua has to be factored into this whole equation. It helped create those changes in congressional restrictions, and it may have led executive branch officials, like Colonel North, to conceal their Contra activities as much because they knew that whatever the law said, exposure to those activities would cause another political firestorm. Would you agree to that?
I do agree with what you say, Mr. Stokes, and I don't challenge it a bit. I guess, and I know this is your motive, that the point is, having said these things, is the end result that the score becomes Congress 1, the executive 0. That's not your intent, obviously, but how do we make things better than that? I think the executive branch could rightly rebut this, you know, and put up a few points in their favor, that as the vote was nearing, there would always be people that were sponsoring a compromise that would say, Boland 1 allows you to keep going. And where a truthful person would have said, we are authorizing dissembling here, if not disingenuousness, because for people in the administration to go ahead and conduct support for the Contras, whose purpose was declared to be to push over the government, you simply portray it as something else, because the Congress, not only the executive, before those votes was saying, yes, our legislative intent is to authorize you to keep doing what you've been doing. Now, that's not so. And I think if I had been in the Congress and were watching what was happening, whether with the mining or other things that you didn't know about, as a congressman, I would have reached out with the only instrument I had, which is law, and enacted Boland 2, because that's all you could do. But this cycle of deception fed itself, I think, and until both of us, in the executive and the Congress, can come down to say, listen, if we've got a national security issue, let's have a discussion of it, a public referendum if we have to, and maybe the administration will win and maybe it won't. But the good news of that is if and when it does win, and on some things it will, whatever country we're involved with then knows we've got the whole country behind us, and it's going to be a saleable policy. I think that's the way it was in Geneva in October of '85.
Let me ask you this. You have testified that in August of '85, the President approved the sale of weapons by Israel to Iran. Did the President specifically approve the November 1985 shipment of Hawk missiles by Israel to Iran, or was it a case of your simply informing him that the Israelis intended to ship the missiles?
The latter, sir.
The latter.
Yes, sir.
What, if
really,
anything...
the former two, that is the September shipment too, that's been an area that's been kind of murked up because the President provided the authority in early August for Israel to undertake to sell arms to Iran and to then come to the United States for replenishment, to buy new ones. That didn't require then the Israelis to come back to us on each occasion and get new approval. It also had limitations on it so that it just wasn't open-ended, but, well, that's the way it was.
Sure. Did the President also know that the CIA would play a role in the shipment?
No, sir, nor did I at the time.
I see. Now, you've testified earlier here about a discussion you once had with Attorney General Meese concerning oral findings. You said that General Meese referred in this conversation to an opinion of his predecessor, Mr. Smith, on this subject. What did you understand would constitute an oral finding by the President?
Well, I think that I may have interpreted wrongly what the Attorney General intended, but as I testified before, what happened in the exchange was that after we had finished the interview on Friday the 21st of November in '86, and were interrupted by a secretary, and he and his assistant, Mr. Cooper, prepared to leave the room. I asked him to stay, and I went through an exchange with him that's in the record about the fact that the President had indeed been for this from the very beginning, this being the sale by Israel of arms to Iran. And he said, well, Bud, I'm glad you told me that. As a practical matter, the earlier the President makes that decision, the better he is in legal terms. And then he went on to say that a determination made by my predecessor has made clear that the President's decision, even though not written, is no less official. And I interpreted, perhaps wrongly, that he was saying that that presidential determination to approve those sales applies as a decision in the finding sense. But that is my word, not his.
I see. Was that your understanding that with reference to the November '85 Hawk shipment that the President had in fact made an oral finding?
I believe that the President's August decision legitimized sales which would occur that fell within the criteria he established. Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, you've also told us Secretary Weinberger focused particularly on legal questions in opposing arms sales to Iran. Do you recall to which statutes he may have referred? For instance, I'm not trying to sandbag you in any way, did he refer to the Arms Export Control Act?
Yes, sir.
Did he make reference to the fact that you must notify Congress prior to sale of arms worth more than $14 million? Did he refer to that?
I don't recall it. I do recall that he made a reference, I think, to the fact that even though it is a foreign country selling the arms, that well, I think he said there are legal restrictions on what must be done if a foreign country does it. That came up when people began to focus on the fact that what was being considered was a foreign act, not an American act. And he pointed out, nevertheless, there are legal restrictions.
And did he at that time to make any reference to the fact that if you are selling arms in excess of $14 million, you must notify Congress?
I don't recall that specifically. He may have.
Mr. McFarlane, at any time in any discussions within the administration of which you were a part or of which you are aware, after the enactment of Boland II, was it at any time suggested that South Africa be asked to provide assistance to the Contras?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
Not to your knowledge?
No, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Tribble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McFarlane, let me ask you one follow-up to the testimony yesterday, and then I'm going to move into another area. Yesterday you had a colloquy with Senator Rudman about the DEA operation to rescue the hostages. And you said, as I recall, in response to Senator Rudman's question, that you did not believe that a finding was required because the CIA was not involved in that operation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
The DEA has told our staff that the CIA was in fact involved and that spent some $50,000 to provide financial assistance to the operation. Were you aware of that fact?
I wasn't, no, sir.
And if you were, that would have changed the substance of your answer.
Yes, sir, I think it would.
Let me move beyond that, if I may. And first of all, I want to thank you and your family for your long years of dedicated public service. And I know the last several days have been difficult for you, and I want you to know that these days are difficult for all of us. This is not a happy assignment, but it's an important one, I think, for our country. Congressional oversight, hard questions, candid responses are essential to guarding against the arrogance and overreach of power in a free society. And that's what we're about. And that's why we're here. Now, I don't want to pursue the factual legal issues that my colleagues in the main have followed. But rather, I'd like to take the time that we have to talk about the broader policy, institutional considerations that are a part of this. The theme of this is through your testimony and the testimony of others to find ways in which we can make the decision-making institutions involved in fashioning foreign policy work more productively together to avoid the kinds of problems that we've experienced of late. So there are 5 areas which I'd like to pursue briefly this morning. First, the role of the National Security Advisor. As we know, the role of the National Security Advisor has changed from one administration to another, from one president to another, reflecting, I guess, in large measure, the interest, the expertise, the management style of our presidents. Kissinger and Brzezinski, for example, were vastly different in their approach to the job than let's say, an Allen or a Scowcroft. My question is this: what was your role as National Security Advisor to this president as you saw it? Were you the clearinghouse? Were you the active advisor inputting policy recommendations?
I believe I saw the job when I came to it as a manager, a coordinator, that was the largest mission that I had.
To see then that the President received coherent advice from his principal advisors.
That's correct, sir.
Now, in regard to the shaping of the decision to sell arms to Iran, my understanding is that the President did receive inputs from the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and others who argued against that policy.
Yes, sir.
So I see through your testimony a portrayal of a president that's not disengaged as suggested by the Tower report, but a president who had the information before him, who understood the risk, but who pursued a policy because he wanted to bring the hostages home. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir.
Well, I make that point only because I think it doesn't necessarily make an unwise policy sound, but at least for me, I'm somewhat more reassured to know that the President is strong and decisive and that he had the strength to make a decision that carried risk, a decision that perhaps would be unpopular, a decision that of course proved to be very unpopular, in pursuing what he felt was right for the country.
Senator Tribble, if I could add a footnote to that, and it's perhaps gratuitous, but it's been made in some comments from your colleagues here that point that if things work, they're praised, and if they don't, they're criticized. There's frequent reference to the Grenada operation in recent years, and it worked, generally. There was very close, well, I should say, complete consultation with the leadership of the Congress before that, and with his cabinet, and there was general disagreement and objection to it being conducted. But he did it. That's what he's paid for. And it worked. And he's done this, and it didn't. But I take your point. He is a decisive man who does what he believes is right.
So, in summary then, in terms of your view of the role of the National Security Advisor in this administration, yours was to act as a clearinghouse, if you will, to pull together the information and the best advice of the principals in the administration and to make that available to the President in the fashioning of foreign policy decisions.
Yes, sir.
Secondly, let me ask you to focus on the role of the National Security Council and the State Department. Obviously, there are tensions, institutional tensions between the two. What, in your judgment, is the proper relationship between the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State? How much dialogue, how much sharing? Should they act as one? How do they go about advising the President in reaching important decisions?
This National Security Advisor ought to acknowledge that the Secretary of State is the President's advocate, advisor, proponent, public spokesman for, steward of foreign policy. He is the dominant figure in foreign affairs, and that the National Security Advisor's job is to facilitate his functioning in that role by taking the Secretary of State's views and integrating them with the advice of other cabinet officers, providing them to the President, and in any way he can to support the Secretary of State and the President. Ultimately, the National Security Advisor works for the President, but his working hours are largely spent constantly in dialogue with the Secretary of State, and as invisibly as possible.
Well, now here there seems to be a sense that the Secretary of State may have been cut out of the action. At least we've learned through your testimony and through other evidence that there were times the Secretary of State was not fully informed about activities in Central America or in the Middle East as they relate to the substance of these hearings. Is that wise? Is that the way the system ought to work?
No, it isn't. And we could disagree over the extent to which he was sufficiently advised, but he should be well advised all the time. You can try to build in checks and balances to make sure that happens in a lot of ways. For example, I thought it wise to have on the NSC staff people who were predominantly career people. And I took a lot of flack about that, but about a third of my staff was career military, another third was career from CIA or the State Department, and another third probably from the outside, who were the President's choices, and properly so.
So there ought to be full consultation then with the principal foreign policy advisor.
Yes, sir.
Let me move to a third area very quickly, and that is really the essence of these hearings, the relationship between the White House, the National Security Council in your case, and the Congress. Now, I'll tell you, I don't always agree with what the Congress does, but I respect the actions of this Congress as the expression of the will of the American people, and it is my view that the White House and the President must honor that expression as well. There seems to be, etched in all that I know about these transactions, an attitude reflected that the White House only knew best, and that the Congress and the American people really could not be trusted with the shaping of foreign policy. Now, I share that view because I think it is reflected in much that we've learned thus far. And it obviously will shape the deliberations of this Congress in the days ahead. So what I'm going to ask you to do is respond to some of the initiatives that we might anticipate. I think Representative Broomfield yesterday touched on the question of oversight, and as I recall, you said that you can go too far, that this president, any president, reacting to ever-changing events in a difficult world has to have a measure of flexibility, and I agree. But I'd like to invite your response to a number of specific items under the heading Overview. There are those that suggest that Congress, the Senate, should confirm the National Security Advisor. Your thoughts about that, please.
It's a close call, but I come down saying that they should not do that, more as a matter of precedent than that is for it being a short step away to confirm as Chief of Staff and others in the White House. There's no question but that the National Security Advisor should be responsive to congressional inquiry. But I believe that the President should be entitled to count upon some confidences from his closest advisors.
So from your experience and insight, you would argue against that?
Yes, I would.
It surely would enhance the competition, I would think, between the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State.
I think that's true. Yes.
And that's not something we want to do for sure. Let me move to a second area. What about placing a statutory limit for Congress to be notified of covert activities? As you now know, the standard, I think, is reasonable time, and there seems to be some dispute over what is reasonable. The White House taking a more liberal view than that of the Congress, oddly enough, on the interpretation of that statutory provision. What about a specific statutory mandate? Time.
That seems to me to be a good idea in principle, but very difficult in practice to decide what is the right time. I think that another approach that I believe you've also promoted is to insist that I think current law be observed, which is that at all that there is no covert action that does not immediately require the notification of at least the 5 or 4, as someone said, perhaps. And that I think that that is feasible and something that is tolerable from the executive branch point of view.
Now, another issue in the oversight category is the obvious need to make policy in confidence from time to time. And there must be ways in which that can be done and yet policy not be made in a vacuum. I think many of the problems we've encountered here may well be attributed to that there wasn't sufficient input from some of the wise heads within the administration and from the Congress as well. To that end, one factor often suggested as a reason for the push toward secrecy is the concern about leaks. Leaks both within the administration and also within the Congress. Now, we have reduced the number of contacts in the Congress over recent years, but it seems to me the experience of this committee, the bipartisan approach taken thus far, the unprecedented cooperation between House and Senate argues rather persuasively for our considering the establishment of one oversight committee composed of the best of the House and Senate, and in that fashion perhaps eliminate opportunities for violating important confidences, and secondly, enhancing the likelihood that this administration, more importantly future administrations, will be forthcoming. Would the establishment of one oversight committee, in your judgment, be a step in the right direction?
Yes, sir, I think that would be a very sensible decision.
Now, another area touched on by the committee was the NSC involvement in operations. And I think you responded to a question about that. But a real problem here, it seems to me, is that the NSC, the National Security Council, envisioned historically to be not the implementer of public policy, but as a clearinghouse, as an originator of ideas, as an advisor, took on an alien role here, and it was mismanaged and it got out of control. What is your thought about the role of the National Security Council in the future? Should it be restricted so that the NSC would not be involved in covert operations?
It seems to me that the idea ought to be explored of shaping terms of reference or limits to the authority of people that serve on the National Security Council staff, but I do not think they should extend to an absolute prohibition on the President being able to use his National Security Advisor in rare and unusual circumstances that he thought justified. And I truly think that they would be very, very rare if the prior condition is reliance upon his Secretary of State as the leading figure is respected. But I think it would be a bad idea. There are times when, because of the foreign state involved and their sensitivity to their own internal problems represented by exposure and risk of a policy they want to change, they need to know, is it even worth talking to us about? And they want to know it from somebody, the President, who is the decision maker.
A classic example of that, I guess, would be the Kissinger mission to China, for example.
It is a good example, I think. There have been dozens of times as well that my own choice, when an issue like this came up, was always to say, let's let the State Department do it. But I recall an occasion, and 3 or 4 years ago, where we had an opportunity with a new Soviet leader, I thought, to get off on the right foot by sending a very clear signal of the President's wishes. Actually, it was his idea, not mine. And we asked the State Department to do it, and it got hopelessly fouled up and didn't work. And well, that isn't to say that will always get fouled up. It won't. The State Department does a terrific job usually. But you never should foreclose being able to use who the President wants.
So, as a normal course of events or affairs, the NSC, in your judgment, ought not to be in an operational mode, but there are times and places where it is important the President can turn to his National Security Advisor to undertake these kinds of roles.
Yes, sir, there are. And even then, the President will, I'm sure, do it with the Secretary of State and completely involved.
Let me move to a fifth and final area, Mr. Chairman, and that is the role of Congress and the President in the shaping of foreign policy. I think there's a truism that we've heard echoed through these hearings, and you mentioned this as well, that you cannot manage a public policy that does not have the support of Congress and the American people. You certainly can't sustain it, and it cannot succeed. My question is this, and it defies an easy answer, but I would welcome, as would my colleagues, your response. It is clearly true that we need to restore a measure of goodwill and trust and bipartisan spirit in the relationship between the Congress and the administration. Any administration. Let me speak in broader terms. Between the Congress and a president. How do we go about doing that? I mean, are there some steps that you can envision from your experience that would help us bridge this gap and begin to speak more clearly with one voice rather than hundreds?
Yes, sir, I believe that there are things that can be done. You've made reference to the need for the President to explain to the people his goals and his policies for achieving them. Unfortunately, if he is explaining to people, Americans, who don't have a very developed understanding of the problem at hand, whether it is Soviet, Chinese, or economic, then their ability to understand and endorse a particular course of action will be limited. Now, that's a lot of hot air, but what I'm trying to say is that Americans haven't taken a lot of interest in foreign affairs because we don't teach it in our schools. We have been blessed to get by with ocean boundaries for most of our history, but not only because of the nuclear age, but economic interests overseas markets, reliance on overseas resources. We are, perforce, a global power with global interests, requiring that our body politic choose people that will conduct themselves successfully. Now, successfully means you must cope with rules of the game internationally, which are quite different from American rules of fair play and decency, and that isn't to endorse them. We should not sink to those levels, but neither should we be so flaccid and puritanical as to presume that posturing will achieve our purposes. Now, all that is to say that we have to work as a long-term proposition on putting foreign history, comparative politics, ideology, things like that in our school system. But that'll take generations. I think as well that there is room and a lot of benefit in restoring authority to the political parties. I think people far more knowledgeable than I can deal with that. It seems to me also that the leadership of the Congress needs to have its authority restored. Obvious means for doing that include giving it the hand on the purse strings again, but other far more learned ideas than I could develop. But I am optimistic. And I say that, and I guess it sounds silly, because of this exercise, because I believe that after all the who struck John gets by us, that there are enough people that are terribly patriotic senators and congressmen who are going to say, 2 years from now, if people look back on this as something that made a lot of TV coverage for making speeches, but nothing changed, we will have failed. Well, this is an opportunity. I think the 5 areas that you talk about are the beginning of a lot of wisdom.
Mr. McFarlane, I absolutely agree. I think it's essential that we pursue the truth wherever it leads us, find out what happened. That's essential, I guess, and necessary to put all this behind us. But I think over the long term, perhaps these hearings can lay the basis for a different kind of approach to the forming and shaping of foreign policy. And if so, then America will be stronger. We've got to find a way to reconcile the obvious need to have a strong and decisive president, the need to respond to the harsh realities of a world that doesn't share our values or vision, with the need to operate within the constraints of the law and the Constitution of the land, and to be open and honest and to consult. And that's not easy, but it has to be done. I thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have 4 remaining members to question. I want to complete, certainly this morning, our witness, Mr. McFarlane, but we will hold to the recess. We'll have a 5-minute recess, return for the 4 members. We'll begin with Mr. DeWine. The select committees will resume sitting, and the chair recognizes Mr. DeWine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McFarlane, first let me thank you for your 4 days of patience and 4 days of testimony. I think one of your major contributions in response to Senator Tribble's question, also in your opening statement, was your comment about the need to restore bipartisan foreign policy in the United States. I suspect that the reason we are here today and that a lot of the problems connected with this whole Iran-Contra situation could be laid at the feet of the fact we do not have really a bipartisan foreign policy today. And if my reading of history is correct, I don't think we really have had one since the Vietnam War era. You alluded in your opening statement on the first day to the successful bipartisan foreign policy that we had achieved after World War II with President Truman, a Democrat in the White House, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, with the support of Republican senators and representatives, and then into the 1950s with Dwight Eisenhower in the White House and the support of Majority Leader Johnson, Sam Rayburn, and really even into the 60s under President Kennedy. And I think if I had one wish, and I think it may be your wish as well, that we could begin the dialogue with these hearings to try to restore that bipartisan foreign policy. So I appreciate your contribution to that, and I think you're in a unique position to help us as we try to do that. Let me move, if I could, to a few questions. When you get to the next to last person, there isn't a whole lot left to ask, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. We're almost to the end of this process. Mr. McFarlane, you have been castigated for not being crystal clear or totally forthcoming every time you reported to Congress, either in a letter or in your testimony. Wouldn't you say, though, that that is really, or at least it should be, a two-way street, that Congress has an obligation to send precise and clear signals about what the policy is?
Yes, sir, I do.
You know, we've been sitting here for 4 days and all last week, and we can't agree on what the Boland Amendment is, and we're the ones that supposedly wrote it. There's a great dispute going on. What it means. Does it apply to the NSC? Doesn't it apply to the NSC? And I'm not going to get into that, but it seems to me that we have some burden and we have some responsibility to be clear about what we're telling you to do and what we're saying the law is and the law isn't. Would you agree with that?
Yes, sir, I do.
Now, having said that, let me just use a little of the prerogative we have as congressmen using our 20/20 hindsight. You know, we sit up here, all of us, and we have great hindsight. But we weren't there. We weren't in the trenches. We weren't making the decisions daily, which unfortunately many times affect people's lives and are really life and death decisions. So I hope you'll take my question in that context, that I realize we got wonderful hindsight, wonderful 20/20 vision here today. Looking back, would you say that it would have been better when you were in the position of National Security Advisor, if you, when you faced these questions, when some of the red lights went off, when you saw Ollie North doing some of these things, when you saw the Boland Amendment and you saw some different interpretations of it, and you saw 3 different versions of the Boland Amendment, when you saw Congress giving aid and not giving aid and doing different things, would it have not been better to call in legal counsel and say, look, give us a legal opinion. Exactly what can we do in this area? Exactly what should we do? And then once you got that opinion, maybe gone out and sat down with your staff and said, this is what we can do and this is what we can't do. Again, it's hindsight, but one of the recommendations of the Tower Commission was that they upgrade the National Security Advisor, the legal staff, and the legal advisor. Would you agree with that recommendation?
I do, Mr. DeWine. I think you point out one of a dozen places where I went wrong. I guess I do feel, though, that there's even a better testimony to my error in the fact that, as I guess I said in the opening statement, I felt that this was a very important issue, that is, showing the Russians that we can deal with this phenomena. But we didn't choose the right instrument to do it. Succinctly put, where I went wrong was not having the guts to stand up and tell the President that. To tell you the truth, probably the reason I didn't is because if I'd done that, Bill Casey and Jane Kirkpatrick and Cap Weinberger would have said I was some kind of a commie, you know. I mean, my own solution would have been that we had better make clear that we're prepared to keep Soviet support for totalitarian regime in this hemisphere out. Now, it has been ironic under this administration, where the president is a man of courage, decisiveness, and action, that every time you try to get the Defense Department to do something, they've got a dozen reasons why they can't do it. Well, a lot of them are good reasons. Most of them aren't. And, but that was my mistake, really. I mean...
Let me follow that up if I could. In your opening statement, I was reading it as you were reading it, and you improvised or added something to that. And I would like for you to expand on that for me if you could in a moment. On page 8 of the transcript, you said, "We had to win this one." And I don't think that was in your initial statement, but you added that, I think, as you were giving your oral testimony, to give it, I guess, special emphasis. We had to win this one. You've also said that, and you just now told us, that maybe one of the problems was going covert instead of overt. And I think you've even alluded to the fact that maybe the president should have, or at least I got the impression you were saying, gone more directly to the American people on this issue. You have had a tremendous amount of experience. You feel very strongly about this issue, and as I look at your opening statement, that is very clear. I would like for you in the next minute or two or three to tell us what you think the President of the United States should have said to the American people about the importance of Nicaragua, about the importance of the region, about, to use your words, why we had to win this one. Why? Why is it important? What do I tell my constituents back home? Or if you were me, what would you tell them? Or if you were the president, what would you say? Why is this so important? Why is this small region of the world so important that many people never heard of before we got into this big debate the last few years?
Well, sir, I do tend to cast the issue of Nicaragua's government as an East-West issue. That is, that the danger is not Nicaraguan soldiers taking on the United States. It is that country serving as a platform from which the Soviet Union or other surrogates like Cuba can subvert neighboring regimes and ultimately require the United States to defend itself against a Soviet threat, whether by spending more dollars on defense that we didn't need to worry about our southern border, whether we need to worry more about the Panama Canal now that Russians are here, whether we need to be concerned about the half of our oil imports which come through refineries in the Caribbean within mid-range of Nicaragua, and all of these reasons that we have been able not to think about, thank goodness, for a long time. And we haven't needed to defend against any of those problems, thank goodness, nor spend the money, nor have the division, ships, aircraft to cope with a problem to our south as we have in Europe to our east. But I think when I say go to the people, I don't mean it in circumvention of the Congress. It is because it is the President's responsibility to establish the foundation of what he believes threatens our national interest. And today, the foremost threat is the military power of the Soviet Union, not its economic ineptitude or all the other failings of its system. Its power, raw military power. Now, in explaining to Americans how that has evolved, since the time of World War II and about a generation after it, when we could be relatively secure in knowing that our nuclear superiority would deter Soviet expansion. About 10 years ago, when that condition of approximate parity was reached, the Soviet Union changed its behavior and generally was more willing to take risks cautiously, but testing us And the way was in their own efforts through surrogates like Cuba and Vietnam to subvert regimes in developing countries. Now, with the lesson of Vietnam behind us, there was little appetite and a lot of logic in avoiding gratuitous U.S. military engagements where our interests are not at stake. But one must at least understand that there are some places where our interests are at stake and where we must be prepared to cope. Now, this isn't to say that in every place we are challenged, the response ought to be U.S. military power. It should not. It must not. We cannot do that. Far preferable is our private investment, our economic support, our foreign aid program, so as to help those countries develop the jobs, opportunity, education, health care for their people, which will assure that their people will not be attracted by Cubans, Russians, and other ideas that don't work. But there are some places where we may not be able to fashion this kind of foreign aid and economic development program to an extent that it is self-sustaining. And that process may be interrupted by the raw use of Cuban or Soviet military power. In those circumstances, we have to understand, first, is it important to our interest? If so, then we may have to use American force to cope with it. Now, there is a twilight area where it isn't clear whether or not the issue can be resolved by the people in the country itself, and that today is that issue in Nicaragua. Well, we should argue over whether or not this freedom fighter movement and implicitly freedom fighter movements elsewhere in the world, from Honduras to the Philippines, are movements that we ought to support. I could give you my criteria for when we should say yes, and basically they are three. The country ought to be vital to us. The movement ought to be popular, truly popular, not some CIA-sponsored ragtag bunch of ne'er-do-wells. And finally, they ought to be competent. Vital, popular, and a competent movement. Now, in Nicaragua today, it isn't their fault that they're not competent. They're well-meaning, very solid people, and they may become competent, but that isn't clear. But Nicaragua is a test case for us, and we're going to have to pull up our socks in the next year or so and either say, yes, it is important that we stop it there, or tell the freedom fighters, don't trust us anymore, we're going to deal with the problem next door when it happens in Honduras or someplace. But let's don't say that it isn't a problem.
Isn't part of the competency problem the fact that the United States has not been consistent, and that was part of the problem you were dealing with? We had the Soviet Union pouring in hundreds of millions of dollars at a time when Congress was saying yes and then saying no and saying yes. That was what you had to deal with as a person who was making that policy, who was dealing with it.
Yes, sir, and I welcome the softball, but no, truly, it's generous of you, but
They always told me, Mr. McFarlane, that softballs were sometimes harder to hit out of the park. So I don't know if it was intended as a softball or not, but it's I think a question that a lot of people are asking.
well, it is a good question, and I ought to simply say that as ambiguous as congressional signals were, they were engendered, I think, by a lack of communication from the executive branch. There was a time when I thought that there was a lot of politics, more politics on the Hill on this issue, that after the first year of President Reagan being on a roll and winning everything, that maybe Democrats picked out that here in Nicaragua was a place he was politically vulnerable and just decided through political motives to go after him. I don't believe that. I've been, for a long time, privileged to have a kind of a funny kind of relationship with this former speaker. And one of the biggest mistakes I ever made was having promoted a policy which he disagreed with, and then mine proved to be wrong. Even after that, he respected my views, and I could always feel confident if I went to him and told him something that he would give me his views, but not sandbag me. In these proceedings, Mr. Boland here, eminently fair and probably the most objective questioning I got here. I think it's a good visible demonstration that it is not a partisan issue. The President feels these things as vigorously as I do, and I think sincerely wants badly his team of people to reach out and do business with the Congress. And I think that there's a lot of evidence that that's going to improve here with Howard Baker and others where they are.
Mr. McFarlane, in answer to Senator Tribble's question, and I won't replow the same ground, but you stated that you felt that part of the problem or the leak problem could be dealt with by combining those committees, both the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee. And I would just like to join that comment. There is a bill in the House of Representatives sponsored by Congressman Henry Hyde of Illinois, and that has, I believe, over 100 co-sponsors. I think there's a companion piece in the Senate, and maybe our experience today is next several months as a joint committee will bode well for the passage of that type of legislation. I think it would help, and I think you have pointed out, as other witnesses have, about the problem in regard to the leaks. Let me ask you one final question. Could you tell us a little bit about your perspective in regard to the strategic importance of Iran to the United States? And my time is almost up, and just maybe a minute or two of that. A lot of people keep asking about that.
Yes, sir. The importance of Iran derives obviously from its geography, sitting astride the lanes between the Soviet Union and the Indian Ocean and beyond. It's been a coveted avenue for commerce and for force projection for centuries. Not only does it block the Soviet position, but it also sits astride the Gulf and is in a position to strangle the international economy by dint of interdicting oil flows through the Gulf. Its importance also derives from its policies, virtually all of which we oppose. The spread of Islamic fundamentalism, its efforts to defeat Iraq, to expand its own influence beyond its borders. For all of these reasons, we should take an interest in Iran, but to recognize that it's essential that it remain at least non-aligned, preferably pro-Western, and attentive to any opportunities we can find to open that channel.
Mr. McFarlane, one of the more often quoted and telling statements that was made in the Tower Commission appears on page Roman numeral 4, number 11. Let me just read it to you. Given the importance of the issue and the sharp policy divergences involved, however, Secretary Shultz and Secretary Weinberger in particular distanced themselves from the march of events. This is in regard to this whole series of events. Do you agree with that? Is that a fair statement based upon what you know, or is that not fair?
It's very fair.
Do you want to elaborate, or is that...
No,
you don't have to.
I don't understand it. I think that the President is paid to make tough decisions, and his cabinet officers legitimately have disagreements. But I think that the President ought to be able to rely upon his cabinet officers to remain engaged and objective and critical where they feel it, but engaged and loyal to the President.
Thank you very much.
Senator Boren.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McFarlane, I hope that the American people have listened very carefully to your answers over the last several days. I know all of us on the committee have listened very intently as you responded to Congressman Stokes and to Senator Tribble and others today, and as you shared your insights with us. This whole process will have been for naught. Painful experience it has been for those who've had to come before the committee, the amount of time that's invested in it. If at the end of all of our proceedings we simply fix blame and responsibility, score political points, total up the scorecard at the end and say the committee is now adjourned. I think you're very right in saying this will only have been beneficial to the country, and after all that's what we're here for, to try to help our country if we learn something from it. And if from all of this painful experience something very positive can come. And I think we've learned some very real lessons together these last 3 days. We've learned, number one, that all of us better get busy and commit ourselves to rebuilding mutual trust between the executive and legislative branches, as you have said so eloquently. We can't do that with rules and regulations or a framework of changes in the system. It's not the system that really is at fault. We can only do that if all of us with goodwill embark on trying to do that. And it can be done. I know what Congressman Stokes is trying to do, and Congressman Hyde on the Intelligence Committee on the House side. Congressman Hamilton has led in the same direction in the past, and Senator Cohen and I have been working with Mr. Gates, Judge Webster, and Mr. Carlucci, those with whom we're given responsibility to work in the intelligence area, and we have, I would say, in the last 3 to 4 months, developed a very candid, open relationship in which all of the information has been shared, in which the confidentiality of that information has been kept, the secrets have been protected on both sides, so that we could really talk with each other. And if we can do that across the board between the executive and legislative branches, we can reknit something that's so important. It's a tragedy. Even our allies know that they can play Congress off against the President, or they can play Republicans and Democrats off against each other to further their own interests, because we have not come together with one American foreign policy. You mentioned Mr. Rayburn, and I look back to that example of what he and President Eisenhower were able to do together. They didn't always agree. I imagine they had some real fights over the breakfast table, but when they came out, they announced an American foreign policy. And we were able to stick to it, and no one was able to drive a wedge between us, and no one was ever to cause distrust between us. And I hope from this that we'll have that kind of relationship again. I think the greatest thing that could happen as a result of these hearings, I wish it to start next week, is for the President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, the Democratic and Republican leaders of the Senate and the House, sit down together, one-on-one, together in a small group, and say, look, we all work for America. We've got to get together. We've got to thrash this out. And above all, we have to communicate. I think that's been a real problem, is that there's been a hesitancy for candid communication. And so I think that lesson is a very important lesson. Not since the period before Vietnam have we truly had a bipartisan consensus foreign policy in this country. And I think if, from all of the pain that we've gone through with this episode, we rebuild it, and we all set to work to do it, what we've gone through here will have been worth it. And the second lesson, I think, has been tragically borne out by your testimony, and that is we must abide by the constitutional process. When I was a governor, there were things I dearly wanted my legislature to pass, and sometimes they didn't pass them, and I was heartbroken, and I thought they'd been wrong. But I never considered trying to go out on my own and implement a program anyway through some sort of private methods. And I think when we do that, we run such grave risk. When we try to get around the law, even laws that we think are unwise, we run a grave risk. I know you as a very honorable man, and as Sam Nunn said yesterday, there is a balance sheet on Bud McFarlane. And like the balance sheet on everyone that has been interrogating you, there's some minuses on it, some mistakes have been made by all of us, and you've acknowledged your mistakes. But there are a lot of pluses too, a great number of pluses. And when you see an honorable man like you, led because we embarked down a path of trying to get around the law, violate your own high standards of personal integrity, when I heard you say, I didn't inform the Attorney General that I anticipated there might be some destruction of documents. Knowing how honorable you are and how much you want to serve the public, I couldn't help but reflect, these are the tragic results of trying to go down the wrong path of not following the normal constitutional process. We also end up having important decisions being made by international arms dealers, people like Mr. Ghorbanifar, who apparently passed only his name in the various lie detector tests that he was given, impacting and making important foreign policy decisions for this country. And that's a terrible mistake, to bring shadowy people at the edges of any kind of accountability to the public into an important policy-making, decision-making role. And again, that's what happens when you try to go around the process instead of having the people who were elected or appointed and confirmed to positions of responsibility make those decisions. And then finally, you end up hurting the very policy that you're trying to carry out. And you and I have spent many hours trying to figure out how we could broaden support for help to the Contras, because I happen to agree with you that we're going to create a power vacuum here in our own backyard, in our own hemisphere, that is going to be filled to our detriment if we don't find some way to help those people regain control of their own country and their own region, if we don't find some way to stop a communist base. So we've learned some very important lessons, and it's been valuable. And you've contributed immeasurably with your candor, opening your heart with us, and the benefit of your intellectual conclusions to the process. Now, the Constitution says that the President, under Article 2, shall see to it that the laws shall be faithfully executed. It doesn't just say that he won't break the law, or that he will avoid technically getting around the law. It says that he shall be the guardian of the law. He shall see to it that it be faithfully executed. In this case, did the President establish any kind of monitoring group to assure that no aid, direct or indirect, would go from the government of the United States to the resistance during this period of time? Did he take affirmative steps to assure that even though he didn't agree with the law, that the law would be faithfully executed?
Senator Boren, the President put in place a system of oversight which is the National Security Council and includes his Vice President, Secretary of State, Defense, and myself. I think it was not the President's system, it was the people, and specifically me, within it. But the President had a proper system.
Well, let me bring you to another provision of law, the Pell Amendment, which I think has been mentioned here briefly, which stated that we needed to make certain that if any other governments were to give aid to the resistance, they would then not receive favors, directly or indirectly, in return. Now, you've said in your opinion you don't believe any did receive favors, although there's certainly some comments in the record that indicate that certain weapons were attempted to be provided to certain countries, one country in particular that expedited some arms shipments. How could the Congress, which passed this law, how could the Congress monitor compliance with the law? How could they make sure that no favors were being given to third countries in return for help to the Contras if the Congress was not even informed that such aid was being given on our own request?
I think the Congress should have been informed.
Let me go back to a question that arose during the testimony of an earlier witness. As we now know, the arms sales to Iran generated about $15 million approximately in what might be called surplus or profits or whatever term you want to use. After we reimbursed the government for $12.5 million, paid the actual expenses of transportation, there was about $15 million left. And we know that a small amount of it, maybe $3.5 million, ended up going to the Contras ultimately in some form or another. When the President issued that finding, and perhaps he had in mind helping get the hostages out, perhaps he had in mind ultimately opening new channels of communication to elements in Iran. Do you think he intended that the prices of those arms would be marked up from what you know about the President's policy and aims in this area. Do you think he intended that private individuals would end up controlling some $15 million of surplus or profits to deal with in their own absolute discretion, to spend as they saw fit without any kind of constraint or control by the government?
No, sir.
So on what do you base your answer that you don't think the President would have intended that the $15 million that would be generated would be able to be used by private individuals as they saw fit?
Well, when I served in the government, which was before this event, the President's mission was oriented exclusively toward Iran and achieving results with Iran. And he did not see it linked to any other policy goal, whether Central America or Asian.
And in your opinion, would it be inconsistent that some $15 million of profits were generated? If you were trying to curry favor with Iran or moderates in Iran to generate $15 million of profit, would that be consistent with that goal, or consistent with the goal of making them happy enough to release the hostages?
No, sir.
Now let me ask you, we know that this whole group of private individuals who say they weren't acting as agents of the government ended up being involved in the efforts in Central America, although as a supporter of aid to the Contras, I'm somewhat disturbed by the fact that they appeared to be charging commissions to the Contras on what they purchased with the donor funds and keeping some of those monies for themselves, investing in machine gun factories and other places. Do you think it is appropriate, and were you aware of the fact that secret encrypting devices, the KL-43s, were being given to private individuals who had no official government status, some of whom didn't even have security clearances? Were you aware of that?
I wasn't. I saw on the trip that some of the people involved with the trip did have these things, and I didn't know that anybody else did. The people that were on the trip, of course, were involved in the mission.
In your opinion, is it lawful during a period of time in which aid by the government, direct or indirect, was banned for us to be giving government property, in fact very highly sensitive, secret encrypting devices, pieces of equipment to private individuals for the purpose of carrying on what they claim was a private operation?
No, sir.
If it had come to your attention as National Security Advisor when you held that position, would you have put a stop to it?
Yes, sir.
Have you had any conversations with the President of the United States since you first began testifying to the intelligence committees last December, or during the testimony that you're now going through in the intervening months, say between December and now? Have you had any conversations with the President, or have had any reaction from the President in terms of the statements that you have been making, either before us or in the news accounts or articles or otherwise?
I've had 2 calls from the President, sir.
What has been the nature of those conversations?
The first one was purely a gracious gesture on the part of the President after I had made a public comment about having erred and feeling responsible, that he didn't feel that way, that he believed he had done the right thing, and it was just an expression of generosity. And the second was 2 nights ago when he called to say that he had watched the hearings and he had thought that they shed more light on this issue than all of the previous efforts put together.
When funds were obtained from these other countries, and you've testified you knew, of course, that these funds were obtained and were going into the private efforts to help the resistance in Nicaragua, was your only oversight over how these dollars were being spent a few oral reports from Colonel North?
That was the only input that I received, yes, sir.
And so really, as I understand it, you didn't become deeply involved in terms of finding out who it was that was handling the money, to make sure that the money was going for helping the Contras and not going into private pockets. You didn't really monitor that very carefully.
Well, I think that I understand your point, and I have met Adolfo Calero, and he seems to me a man of honesty, and I did know, in fact, that the money went to an account that he controlled and no one else. And now it's true, one has to make some judgments about whether you're going to get involved with a movement at all or not, but one of the criteria is the leader of it an honest person.
Did you know that some of the funds, some of which were paid by Mr. Calero into accounts, ultimately were going to come under the control of Mr. Secord, Mr. Hakim, Mr. Kleins, and others that have been involved in some way or another in the international arms trade?
Well, I've never met Mr. Hakim nor Mr. Kleins nor most of the other figures in this investigation. I have met General Secord, and I've worked with him in the government and found him to be a man of integrity. I didn't know is a short answer, but I would not have objected to General Secord being in custody of money.
Would you have had different feelings if you'd known he was going into partnership with Mr. Hakim, who would actually have custodial rights over the accounts, and with Mr. Kleins and others with whom he associated himself in the operation?
Well, yes, sir, I would want to know whomever were going to have authority to tinker with the money.
Well, again, let me thank you, Mr. McFarlane, and again say, as I said in the beginning, there are many pluses on that ledger on the side of your public service, and I hope all of us will learn from what you've said, and I hope we'll all endeavor to embark on a crusade to form an American policy, one in which we all realize we work for the same people in the same government, and I appreciate your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Boren.
Mr. Jenkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McFarlane, I want to echo the comments of Senator Boren. I, from the Democratic side, have been one of those that supported the Contra effort. I truly believe in a bipartisan foreign policy in this country. I think that we began the road down when there was so much dissension. Lack of bipartisanship in President Carter's years. I saw terrible political fights that I thought were not right for the nation. I've seen some during this administration. I say that as a preface to my remarks. While I supported government action, I'm extremely disturbed, disappointed, shocked at the activity of people within this administration in soliciting private funds, in soliciting aid from third countries, from foreign countries, after the Bolin Amendment had been adopted. You know, I win some and lose some, as you indicated, and you have, I think, a feel for the legislative branch. But it seems to me that when we get into seeking and soliciting funds from other countries, when the Congress has decided that that's not the right approach, that is fraught with difficulties, great dangers. And I think you've alluded to that somewhat during your testimony. Nevertheless, you were aware or have become aware that those solicitations were taking place. Is that correct? From country A, B, C, D, and others?
Well, my testimony hasn't been in quite those terms, Mr. Jenkins, but I was conscious that other countries were contributing. That is correct.
And you were conscious also, were you not, that, or became aware later, that the State Department, certain people within the State Department, as well as Colonel North, were actually soliciting funds?
Yes, sir.
has been stated,
I believe the State Department solicitation is, I assume, well-known, a legal act.
I'm not questioning the legality of it. I'm questioning the perception
Yes, sir.
that could develop. Let me give you an example. If I were not a practical person, and I hope a fair person, I might, having discovered what I have discovered in the last 3 or 4 days, come to a terrible decision on a matter that was very important to the Congress, very important to me individually. In October 1985, when the State Department was scheduling an appointment for Colonel North to meet with one of these countries that later contributed $2 million, I was involved in a tough legislative battle in this House. On October the 12th, I believe, of 1985, this House passed a textile bill, very controversial. At that very time, Colonel North apparently was soliciting from a nation that was impacted by this bill funds secretly. And that country later delivered $2 million, according to the testimony. The President vetoed that bill in December 1985. And between December 1985 and August 1986, when the Congress decided to sustain the President by an 8-vote margin, there were entreaties apparently made to many other nations that were impacted by this legislation. Now, I am pointing this out without making any allegations because I don't think that that occurred. As I say, I'm a fair person. But as I see a nation that is severely impacted by a congressional bill where the State Department is involved in lobbying against it, and the administration, through its agents, goes to a foreign nation that is impacted or may be impacted and say, we need financial help secretly. And it is delivered. Is that nation placed in a compromising situation if that legislation is important one way or the other to that country?
Well, what is worse, we would be.
So this is the type of thing that is extremely dangerous from a perception standpoint, is it not?
I agree with that, yes.
I think I could go back into my district or around this country and say, while I was fighting for this bill, unbeknown to me, one of the nations that was severely impacted was secretly giving millions of dollars to the executive branch that later vetoed the bill. That ought to be disturbing to me, don't you think?
I agree, sir.
That is the type of danger that I see and which you see. And this type of private, secret solicitation and funding of efforts that you and I agree with as far as the government action. But I hope you, and I hope the administration, presently the President, will see the problem with this type of policy. Now, I want to get off of that. I simply, as a country lawyer, wanted to explain to the administration that this type of action is extremely unwise, in my view. With my limited time on a totally different subject, I want to ask about some very simple questions about the DEA hostage situation, because this was news to me. Whose idea was the DEA hostage ransom plan, Mr. McFarlane?
I believe that the DEA agents, one of them identified to Colonel North that they had, in the line of duty, had contacts that they had made in Lebanon that they had determined had, they thought, influence with the captors, and that Colonel North elevated it to me, and I referred him to the Attorney General for determination of whether or not the DEA officers could properly participate in using their talents for other than DEA purposes. And I talked to the President about it, and the legalities and so forth were handled by the Attorney General, and it was a matter of consensus between the Attorney General, the President, myself. It's a very sketchy summary I've given you.
Well, let me ask you this. Was the President's approval oral, or was it in writing?
Well, reporting on the matter was fully above board and on writing, and probably as a matter of record. I honestly don't know whether that is written down on paper or not, but it was not anybody's inhibition about it.
Yeah. Was there a meeting with the Attorney General and the President and others on this matter?
I don't believe so.
Who in the administration knew about the plan besides the Attorney General and the President?
I don't know, Mr. Jenkins.
As I understand it, the expenses of the DEA agents to carry out this hostage ransom plan were to be paid from the monies raised for the support of the Contras. Is that correct?
I've learned that, and oh, yes.
Was the President aware that these Contra funds were going to be used in carrying out the DEA plan?
I don't think he was, no, sir.
You do not recall whether or not he
I don't
specifically...
believe he was.
Was the Attorney General aware of the source of these funds for the DEA ransom operation?
I don't know, sir.
Well, was it ever discussed as to where the money was coming from, other than it was coming out of the Contra funds?
I don't believe so, sir.
Mr. McFarlane, I know my time is up. I simply want to express my appreciation to you. You have I have not known you before. I've listened to you very closely. You have a lot of members from both sides of the aisle that have a great deal of respect for you. Your testimony has been long and hard, and I'm convinced that you have attempted to be truthful with this panel, as you have attempted through the years as you worked with the legislative branch. I simply want to thank you for your testimony even though I'm sure that you'll be delighted to see this day over, because it's been 4 long, hard days for all of us, and particularly you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins.
Mr. McFarlane, you've probably been impressed, as I certainly have, with the quality and thoroughness of the questions that have been asked by my colleagues. And you will be pleased to know that I really do not intend to ask you any questions. I do want to make a comment, and if you would like to respond, you certainly are invited to do so, but you don't need to. First, I want to thank you for your testimony, as others have done. You've been generous in your time. You've been very careful in your responses. And you certainly have helped these 2 committees understand these complex set of facts. You've provided very important insights into what went wrong in the foreign policy making process, and we're grateful to you. I think the totality of your testimony is a crucial document for our purposes and certainly for the purposes of history. And I want to commend you for it, and at the same time I want to express to you some of my concerns about it. Your opening statement deserves, in my judgment, very high praise. Your insights there are worth reflection throughout our inquiry, and I hope by students of the foreign policy making process. There are a number of aspects of it that are good. I want to point out one statement in which you say that if we had a large strategic stake, it was clearly unwise to rely on covert activity as the core of our policy, and you've often reiterated that in your testimony. I think that's a great insight into the foreign policy making process and what went wrong in this case. And you point out that there are 2 reasons why you cannot use covert actions for this kind of a purpose. Both are valid. You can't get the resources for it. You can't sustain popular support. And you stated that when the President and the Congress cannot agree to charge ahead, I think were your words, is to invite disaster. I think those and other remarks are really significant statements, and I applaud you for them. I hope they will be read, studied, absorbed. Now, what concerns me is the disparity between your opening remarks and the remainder of your testimony. The approach to the making of foreign policy set forth in your opening statement is, in my view, quite at odds with the foreign policy process you have described in your subsequent testimony. And to my mind, at least, they are hard, if not impossible, to reconcile. I'll not go into a lot of detail here, but let me quote some of your words. When questioned about various aspects of your involvement in providing assistance to the Contras, you've told us that you, quote, used some tortured language, end of quote. That you did not provide, quote, a full account, end of quote. That you were, quote, too categorical, end of quote. And that you gave the Congress, in response to congressional inquiries, quote, incomplete statements, end of quote. In testimony under oath before the Foreign Affairs Committee last year, when you were asked about the contributions, you responded, quote, I have no idea of the extent of that or anything else, end of quote. And you said, I have seen the reports and heard that Country 2 contributed. The concrete character of that is beyond my ken, end of quote. Now, I've been impressed as I've sat here for these hours again and again with the clear discrepancies between what you and others in the administration told the Congress that the administration was or was not doing, and what in fact was done. And so I ask myself, how can the Congress find out what is happening? If the National Security Advisor of the President of the United States and other high officials do not provide complete and accurate answers to the Congress, what can we do? How must we frame our questions to get the facts? Must we put every executive branch official under oath who comes before us? Must we regard every claim of executive privilege and every statement of explanation with great skepticism? When can we be assured that we're hearing the whole truth? How can we get a total account of what is happening so that we can be a responsible partner rather than an adversary in the process? How can our system of government work if the administration is not candid in its answers to the Congress? The Congress only knows one way to get information, and that's through the process that we're engaged in here. Senator Sarbanes asked you who or what you were trying to shield or protect, and you said in short that you were trying to protect yourself, and repeatedly during these hearings you have volunteered to take the blame, the whole blame, on yourself. I appreciate your willingness to shoulder great responsibility. I admire you for it, but I cannot accept that answer. As the National Security Advisor, you are the spokesman for the President of the United States. And when we write to you, we do not write to Mr. McFarlane, we write to you as the representative of the President. And when you spoke to the Congress and when you wrote to the Congress, we accepted your words and your assurances as those of the President. You spoke for the President. And the responsibility must rest with him as well as with you. You cannot, it seems to me, accept responsibility for mistakes, as admirable as that may be, and thereby absolve the President of responsibility. Now, as long as I've been in the Congress, every president calls for bipartisanship in foreign policy, and we all want bipartisanship in foreign policy. But bipartisanship requires Congress's informed consent. It cannot merely be a call to support the President's policy. And I do not see how the events that you have described, the lack of trust between Congress and the executive, the lack of candor in response to congressional inquiries, the failure to volunteer information, the misleading responses, the resort to technicalities and nuances, I do not see how those events create the conditions which make a bipartisan foreign policy possible. And you are quite right, as you have told us a number of times, that each branch of government must have a healthy respect for the other branch's constitutional responsibility in foreign affairs. We're not adversaries in this process, we're partners. And I know that the Congress bears some responsibility, as many of my colleagues have pointed out, for some of the wrongs that you mentioned in making foreign policy. So all of us, Mr. McFarlane, will remember your testimony with gratitude to you and with appreciation. And I hope all of us will work a little harder in carrying out our efforts to achieve an honest and a complete dialogue between the Congress and the executive. Otherwise, if, as you have told this committee, we invite disaster. So we thank you, sir, for your testimony. Do you have any further statement?
Mr. Chairman, you have indeed, I think, expressed a collective sentiment eloquently. There is no rebuttal. The 4 days of testimony have been perhaps 1% of time that you and I have invested in this in the past 6 months. And the truth that I think you have produced here is not a truth of 4 days, but of considerable time, and you and others have spent in private sessions, not public, but they have produced truth. They don't excuse that in public settings, less than a complete picture has been told before. But nor should they hide that the public treatment often of matters of embarrassment to others, not to us alone, are important. But I respect enormously what you have said, those of your colleagues, and believe you have chaired a very constructive exchange, and I appreciate it.
All of us wish you well, Mr. McFarlane, in the days ahead. This concludes the morning session. We will reassemble at 2 o'clock for other witnesses. The committees stand in recess. The joint hearings of the two select committees will come to order. May I begin by advising my colleagues that we have just had a brief meeting of the chairman and ranking members, the chairman and vice chairman of the Senate and the chairman and ranking member of the House committees. We are very conscious of the time constraints that we confront. We've had very extended sessions with our two previous witnesses, and it is absolutely essential that we begin to move along at a quicker pace. Thus, we